Hello and welcome to the video, where we will be going over the 80-20 principle by Richard Koch, the secret to achieving more with less. And this book is really special to me because I honestly cannot think of an area in my life that the 80-20 principle has not helped me improve my quality and my experience. Whether it comes to business, whether it comes to making these YouTube videos, whether it's a fact of my fitness and my health or my relationships, I really cannot think of an area that the 80-20 principle hasn't helped me in some way, shape, or form. But before I start rambling too much about myself, let's talk a little bit about Richard and about this book. So Richard is a consultant, a businessman, and an author. He's written a bunch of books surrounding the 80-20 principle, including this one, the 80-20 principle, The Secret of Achieving More with Less. He's also written the 80-20 individual, The 9 Essentials of 80-20 at Work. He's written Living the 80-20 Way, Work Less, Worry Less, Succeed More, Enjoy More. And you can find more about this book and many of his other books at the8020principle.com. He's got an entertaining and practical applications of all the 80-20 principles in his books. Specifically in this one, I find it really interesting because Richard is obviously a doer. He's an action taker. He's a consultant, a businessman, and an author. So he's really living these principles, and that's exactly who we should be listening to. He's really the 80-20 guru of our day and age, is what I would say, because this concept has been around for quite a while. In fact, we'll talk about how it was actually discovered in the 19th century by a man named Wilfred Pareto. But really what this is Richard retelling it in the framework of today, through business, through relationships that are happening today, just basically using it as a lens to view how we live our lives today. And one of the best quotes that I pulled out of the book is the 80-20 principle, like the truth, can make you free. You can work less. At the same time, you can earn more and enjoy more. The only price is that you need to do some serious 80-20 thinking. So the 80-20 principle, it actually states that 20% of our efforts lead to 80% of the results. And it's also known as, we talked about before, the Pareto principle, or the principle of least effect, which you might have heard about, you may have heard it called those things before, and it's essentially the same thing. It's incredibly powerful when it's applied to a number of different areas. Specifically, we can talk about business, relationships, learning, success, sales, marketing. You really can apply this principle to almost anything. And that's what we talk about quite a lot on this channel, is not talking about hacks, tips, or tricks, but we're talking about principles that we can live our lives by and that are effective in many different areas. They have an effect that's almost fractal across all areas of our life. And the 80-20 principle is a great example of that specifically. And we'll even talk about that a little bit more in this point of it's everywhere. So one of the quotes from the books goes, 80-20 thinking requires and with practice enables us to spot the few really important things that are happening and ignore the mass of unimportant things. It teaches us to see the wood for the trees. And so much when we're talking about self-improvement, we're talking about productivity, we're talking about time management, so much of it is to hack out the things that are not important, to spend more time on the things that are really important, and let some of the unimportant things fall by the wayside. That's our highest leverage. So we'll talk about Wilfred Pareto, the man who actually found this principle and how he found it. He was an Italian economist who studied wealth and income distribution in the 19th century in England. During his studies, he realized that the majority of the land and wealth was controlled by a minority of the individuals. So you can see where the principle came from. It says, in fact, 80% of the wealth was owned by 20% of the people. When he tested this principle, he found that this is not only held true in almost all other countries, but also in his garden, where 20% of the pea pods yielded 80% of the peas. Now, since Wilfred noticed the 80-20 principle in economics and in gardening, other experts have identified it in many other fields. For example, 20% of the criminals do 80% of the crime, and 20% of the motorists cause 80% of the accidents. 20% of married individuals, it says 80% of the accidents, but that's a mistake. That's 80% of the divorces. And 80% or 20% of your carpet probably gets 80% of the wear, and 20% of the streets get 80% of the traffic. So what I would say to you in this point is just to look around. Where do you notice the 80-20 principle currently in your life? You might want to think about opening your awareness to where you're spending your time. Are you spending your time on something 80% of the time that's giving you 20% of the joy in your life, for example? Look at your income. Where are you making that income? Are you spending 80% of your time making your income in ways that are only 20% effective? Or are you doing the vice versa? Are you already living the 80-20 principle? Who do you spend your time with? Are you spending 80% of your time with people who only give you 20% of the happiness in your life? And what about what you're reading and you're learning? Are you spending 80% of your time learning the things that are only 20% effective when it comes to your education and your reading and your learning? We'll talk about a lot of these things as it pertains to application, which is the next point in our mind map on the 80-20 principle. So application, what we're going to talk about here is 20% of what we do leads to 80% of the results. But 80% of what we do leads to only 20%. So we are wasting 80% of our time on low value outcomes. And you can see what we're going to talk about during this application point is how can we spend more time at that 20%? Or how can we spend less time or cut out completely the 80% of what we do that leads to only 20% of the results? So his advice when it comes to applying the 80-20 principle is to calm down, work less, and target a limited number of very valuable goals where the 80-20 principle will work for you. And this is what we talk about so much again on this channel, that planning is so important. So you can see, target a limited number of very valuable goals. And having a goal is so important. Quite often we are just kind of running around like a chicken with our heads cut off, trying to accomplish all of the things that are in front of us, kind of playing a game of whack-a-mole with our lives, as opposed to having that set of a limited number of very valuable goals and then using the 80-20 principle to be able to achieve them. So let's talk about applying it. Step back for a minute and look at any area of your life. Where is this principle at work? Can you see the 80-20 principle at work in your income? Can you see it at work in your relationships? Can you see it at work in your business? Can you see it at work in the way that you spend your time? And how can you maximize the amount of time that you are spending on the 20% that's producing 80% of the results? And then after you do that, how can you minimize the amount of time that's spent on the 80% that produces the 20% of the results? Now, Koch talks a lot about working less and getting more, and that's kind of the theme of the book. And that's tends to be what I like to do as well. I like to limit my amount of working hours and get the maximum amount of results from those working hours. That's how I tend to work the best. But some of you might want to keep in mind that you can work the same amount of time, or the same amount of time that you are working currently, and you can get 5 times more done just by doing the math, by cutting out the 80% and focusing only on the 20%. So after we've talked about application a little bit, I would implore you to go through the different areas of your life that you find important, that are meaningful to you, and look at how you can apply this principle, and not be afraid to cut out some of the 80% that is only giving 20% of the results, and not being afraid to focus deeply on that 20%. It might feel scary in the beginning, but we'll talk about being unreasonable a little bit later, and that's going to help you move through that fear that you might have around spending a lot more time on the 20%. So now we're going to dive deep and talk a little bit about how you can apply the 80-20 principle to your business. Now, it doesn't just apply to business, but this is how I'm going to show you exactly how you can use that application framework that I talked about before when it comes to your business. And you can apply this the same way in many different areas of your life. So he says that the 80-20 principle suggests that your strategy is wrong. If you make most of your money out of a small part of your activity, you should turn your company upside down and concentrate your efforts on multiplying this small part. So if you are, let's say, a coach or a consultant, and 20% of your clients are giving you 80% of the results, they're giving you 80% of the income, they're giving you 80% of the referrals, and etc. You should focus the majority of your time on those clients, and you should fire the rest. find more clients like the 20% and repeat. So 20% of products usually account for about 80% of the dollar value sales. So do 20% of the customers. 20% of the products or customers usually account for 80% of an organization's profits. And I can tell you that this is absolutely true in all 3 or 4 of the businesses that I've started since I started my entrepreneurship journey. It definitely is true. It also is true in a different way, that 20% of your clients are going to give you 80% of the headaches, and those are the ones that you should be looking to get rid of. It can most certainly be true that you make at least 80% of your profits and cash in 20% of your activity and in 20% of your revenues. The trick is to work at which 20%. So you can see that this really ends up being fractal, especially in the business realm, where 20% of your revenues, right? He's not talking about not 20% of your profits. He's saying that 20% of your clients are giving you 20% of the revenue, or 20% of the net revenue, 20% of the revenue. And then 20% of that revenue is giving you 80% of the profits. So you want to look deeper and deeper, and this is kind of the essence of The One Thing by Gary Keller. Now he goes on to say that executives may suspect that some customers and some products are more profitable than others. But when the extent of their difference is provided, they are likely to be surprised and sometimes dumbfounded. And as I can definitely attest to this, before I knew about the 80-20 principle, I didn't really have a good handle on where my money was coming from. And ever since I implemented a spreadsheet in order to be able to look at where my income's coming from based on how many hours I'm working on a certain thing, I've been able to really 80-20 my business and focus on the things that are going to be producing the most revenue for me. So a little bit more application when it comes to business. Do you currently know where your revenue is coming from? And if you don't, can you set up some sort of a spreadsheet or some sort of an application to be able to find it out? And do you know where you're spending your time? So you can really figure out how much your time is worth by putting your revenue over top of the time that you're spending on the revenue. And then you should find that out. Start cutting out the 80% that is not only giving you 20% of the results, or if you put it this way in business, start cutting out the 80% that is giving you the smallest returns. And then double down on the 20% that is giving you the highest amount of returns. Or you could just enjoy your free time. So I'll put it into the lens of this YouTube business. This principle is a huge part of me building this YouTube business that you're noticing. And it informs multiple different areas of my work here. It informs what books I choose to review. I don't choose to review 80% of the books out there because I think most of them are not very valuable, putting it nicely. 20% of the books that are ever produced are really, really valuable, and those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. And with my mind mapping process, only about 20% of the points in any book are going to be important to me and my audience. So I try and make sure that during my mind mapping process, I only focus on the 20% that is the most valuable and actionable information. And it's also what I decide to include in my courses. From these books, I develop my self-coaching course. And from these books, only about 20% of the 20% that happens to be in the mind map is included in my self-coaching course. So you can see it really is fractal, and you can really distill down what is truly, truly important. And also it's 80-20 of how I spend my time. I try and make sure that the maximum amount of time that I spend is spent providing valuable content for you. Because that's the 20% that is going to be helping me grow this YouTube business. Now I could spend much more time advertising my videos. I could spend more time doing outreach for potential collaborations and etc. But I've decided that providing super valuable content is going to be what helps me the most in the long run, and that's what I've chosen to focus on. So the next point I think is so beautiful, and this is missing from a lot of self-help and self-improvement books. It's to be unreasonable. Everything you want should be yours. The type of work you want, the relationship you need, the social and mental and aesthetic stimulation that will make you happy and fulfilled. The money you require for the lifestyle that is appropriate to you, and any requirement that you may or may not have for achieving or service to others. If you don't aim for it all, you'll never get it all. To aim for it requires that you know what you want. So he talks about, obviously we can achieve anything we want to achieve. We deserve anything that we wish and desire. But we first need to know what we want, and that's very important. So it's a genius quote. I really believe that. I think this is one of the best quotes in the entire book, even though it's not about the 80-20 principle. But why shouldn't we be able to achieve everything we want? And I think that the 80-20 principle is really a valuable tool to help us get there. And this comes from chapter number 11, which I think is so greatly titled, You Can Always Get What You Want, which is a beautiful title as well. So I wanted to talk about being unreasonable here. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adopt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. And that's George Bernard Shaw. So here are a few of the questions that you can keep in mind when you're thinking about the 80-20 principle. But what I want you to keep in mind before we even go into the questions is that adopting the 80-20 principle into your life requires you to be unreasonable. You're going to have to cut out things that other people want you to do. You're going to have to cut out parts of your business that people might think you're crazy for cutting out. You're going to have to spend your time in ways that other people think you're crazy for spending your time. You're going to have to relax, and you're going to have to let go of a lot of the things that people think are very important for you, your business, and your relationships, and even just in your regular life. You're going to have to be unreasonable in order to live the 80-20 way. So think about this. What do you want? What do you absolutely love? What comes to you effortlessly? With whom would you spend your days? What would you do throughout the day? How much would you make? And where would you live? This is all about knowing what to aim for. It requires that you know what you want. And it really is the essence of crafting your vision. If you know anything about the Robert Dilts model that I talk about quite a lot on this channel, you'll know that crafting your vision is the first and most important step in the process of determining your life. And with my self-coaching course, this is the first thing that we go over. One of the cornerstones to success that most people miss. They don't even know what they want to achieve before they set out down the path. So, I would leave you with this point: to be unreasonable and to know what you want and not be afraid to take action towards it, using, of course, the 80-20 principle that we're talking about today. The next point that I wanted to make is what's easy. So it's a question that you should ask yourself. It's important to focus on what you find easy. This is where most motivational writers go wrong. They assume that you should try things that are difficult for you. And this is really the core of identity. What are your strengths? We talk about Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker. He talks about how you should set goals and after 18 months, figure out whether you were able to achieve those goals or not. And if you were able to achieve those goals, then you must be strong at that specific thing that you set out to do. And if you weren't able to achieve it, maybe that's not for you. Maybe that's not one of your strengths. So pursue those few things where you are amazingly better than others and that you enjoy the most. And that really is, those are both not mutually exclusive. Quite often the things that we are amazingly better than other people at is because we enjoy it the most. And because we enjoy it the most, we become amazingly better than other people. So this is a quote from Martin Seligman. He says, "I do not believe that you should devote overly much effort to correcting your weaknesses. Rather, I believe that the highest success in living and the deepest emotional satisfaction comes from building and using your signature strengths." And I really believe on that. And again, with your identity, it's so important to know yourself, and then so important to be true to yourself, what your strengths are, and play to your strengths. You don't see very many crossovers in professional sports. Very, very few. Not very many hockey players who are elite athletes can switch over and become soccer players who are also elite athletes. They're both very, very good at their own respective sports, but they aren't able to cross over. And the few athletes who have been able to do it didn't perform to their highest level in both areas. So another quote says, "You are the best you. You will always be the second best anyone else." And this one I speaks so much to me because I see so many people out there living their lives from someone else's identity. They've let someone else craft a vision for them, and then because someone else has crafted their vision, they then have to become someone other than themselves in order to fulfill that vision. You have to be really careful where your programming is taking you. Think about this. What is your vision for your life? And is that your true vision? Or is it a vision that someone has sold to you or someone has told to you? So it's important to find your passion. And these two questions will really help you look for it. What do I enjoy doing the most? And what am I amazingly better at than other people? And that's a great place to start. From your identity, you'll be able to find what your true vision should be. And I think that this part right here, what's easy? It also, again, it's fractal. You can spread this across many different areas of your life. You can spread it across business. You can spread it across fitness. You can spread it across your diet. You can spread it across relationships and etc. Really looking for what's easy in every area of your life is what you should be doing. Now, I'm not saying be lazy. I'm saying what's easy to you. What might be difficult to other people, but is easy to you. That's what you should be looking for. So we'll talk about the 80-20 principle in relationships next. Koch says that relationships help us to define who we are and what we can become. Most of us can trace our successes to pivotal relationships. And this goes back to the quote of you are the 5 people that you surround yourself with. And as you'll see in this relationship exercise, it's very important to choose who you decide to surround yourself with. Because 20% of your friends and loved ones probably account for 80% of your enjoyment and satisfaction. This is true with business relationships and personal relationships. And it might sound harsh, but why wouldn't you spend more time with the people who bring you the most joy? It just seems to make sense. Koch says in the book that the action implications should be plain. Go for quality rather than quantity. Spend your time and emotional energy reinforcing and deepening the relationships that are most important. And again, this is just living the 80-20 principle. Those people that you most enjoy spending your time around, you should double down on those relationships. And necessarily, after doubling down on those relationships, you will have to cut out some of the 80% that are not giving you very much enjoyment or satisfaction. And you have to be okay with that. And this is where we're coming back to being unreasonable. To a certain extent, some of your friends, family, and etc. might think you're being unreasonable by spending less time with them. Now, you don't necessarily have to tell them that you're going to spend less time with them, but they might notice and they might feel you being unreasonable. But you have to push past that because, as we talked about before, that quote by George Bernard Shaw, the unreasonable man adapts the world to himself. And that's what we need to be. The unreasonable man. So we got another quote here by Abraham Maslow that I think just absolutely totally explains 80-20 and relationships. He says that self-actualizing people have these especially deep ties with rather few individuals. Their circle of friends is rather small. The ones that they love profoundly are few in number. Partly, this is for the reason that being very close to someone in this self-actualizing style seems to require a good deal of time. Devotion is not a matter of a moment. One subject expressed it like this: I haven't got time for many friends. Nobody has. That is, if they are going to be real friends. And how true is that? You know, I feel like as we get older, we realize this more and more and more. And we decide to spend time with fewer and fewer people, but we spend time deepening those relationships. And that's such an important part of growing up and becoming a self-actualized person, is to grow deeper and deeper in our relationships. So this is the exercise from the book, and I'm just going to say that I think that this is a great exercise, but I tend to be less structured than this exercise, if I'm being totally honest. I think this is definitely a living and breathing thing, as with anything inside of this 80-20 principles sites, so to speak. Choosing to spend time with friends who give you value in particular moments, right? There might be years where you're spending quite a lot of time with a specific individual, and you're really deepening and deepening and deepening your relationship. But you have to be willing to let go of that relationship when the time comes. You can't continue to hang out with people who aren't giving you value in those particular moments, so to speak. Just remember, you got to be unreasonable. You have to be willing to let go of some of those relationships if they're not serving you in a way that you wish they would. So if they're not adding value, don't be afraid to defy the social norms. You could write down a list of your top 20 friends. If you're more of a structured person than I am, I definitely wouldn't be doing this. You could write down your top 20 friends. You could take 100 points and allocate them according to how much value each friend gives you. Take another 100 units and allocate them according to the amount of time that you spend with each friend. And then look at them at the end. The amount of time that you're spending versus the amount of value that they give you. Do they match up? Why or why not? And you can see that this is essentially the same way that we did it in business before this. We looked at the amount of time that you're spending versus the amount of revenue that you're getting in. And you can look at it as a relationship between the two numbers. And once you look at that relationship, you know which to cut out and which to keep. And it's essentially the same way in every area that you would be using the 80-20 principle. Now, this one I know that a lot of you are probably excited about. This is learning. Books can be read far faster, but never read a book from cover to cover, except for pleasure. When you are working, find out what the book is saying much faster than you would by reading through. Read the conclusion, then the introduction, then the conclusion again, then dip lightly into any interesting bits. I love that. So this comes out from his tutor at Oxford. First, he told him not to attend the lectures because the books could be read much faster. I think that is hilarious. And that's the way that I look at education right now as well. I mean, there's so much education out there that you could get so much faster than the way that they are currently teaching it in universities and even in a lot of classes. So much information is out there for free on YouTube, and so much information is out there for very small amounts of money in some of the great books in the world. And I think that you can learn much, much faster than can be taught in a school type environment. So I wanted to give you guys the way that I like to read a book. And first I wanted to say, often I find people get stuck when they're trying to read a lot of books, right? You'll have a book that you want to read and it'll take you a month or 2 months to read that book when really it should take one afternoon. And it's because you're trying to read it cover to cover and you're trying to not miss any information. But as with the 80-20 principle, we have to be willing to miss 80% of the information to find the 20% that is the most important. And this is how I go about doing that for the mind maps. First, I'll read the introduction. So I do it a little bit different than his tutor told him to do. And then I'll read the conclusion. And then here's a big point that not many people will think about. I'll listen to an interview, whether it's maybe it's a TED Talk, maybe it's a podcast, and etc. But basically what the author does inside of that interview, quite often, if you can find one, is they'll condense all the most important points that they think, and they'll tell it to the interviewer or they'll tell it to the audience that they're presenting in front of. And you can hear it in their own words. And then any points that stick out to me, that's what I'll go and I'll try and find in the book. And then I'll come and I'll get a quote and then I'll explain it to myself in the mind map. So I'll mind map the book. I'll mind map the book into points made right from this interview quite often if I can find one. And then what I'll do is I create these child topics right here from this main topic, these main topics that I create. And then I fill in the points made following this, right? I use the why, what, how, what if, Bates and levels of learning. I say, why should I know about this point? And that quite often is encompassed in the point, right? So up here, books can be read far faster. Obviously, this point right here is telling us that we should be able to read much faster than we could learn potentially in a class. And that's why we should pay attention to learning. What? And again, it's covered in this point right here. It's when you're working, find out what the book is so it tells you what you should be doing. And then how is usually the point that I create for you guys. How often do you read a book? You can see that I even used the word how in the beginning here. And you'll see that that's exactly what we're doing here. How is an exercise? How is what you can do, how you can apply something in the basic levels of learning. And then what if is giving you a situation that might not be your situation, but giving you an example of how it's working in a situation for me. And then you can use that to reflect it back on yourself. And you can see that I'm actually doing that right now. This is how I read books for the mind map. You can see that I included that right here. So I hit you guys at all different levels of learning so that whatever point sticks out to you the most from the main point on the Bates and levels of learning, that's what you'll stick to and remember. And that's the same way that I do it as well. I like to make sure that I know why I should know the point. I like to know what the point actually is. I like to know some exercises that I can do in order to apply the point into my life. And then I also like to think about different situations where this point might be important. It's very interesting that you can use it in mind mapping and learning. You can use it in all sorts of different ways. So the final point from the book that I wanted to make is to focus. And this is a very interesting point because, again, this is an application of 80-20 throughout many different areas of our life. And he says in the book that whenever you spot a 20% activity, run to it, surround yourself with it, immerse yourself in it, patent it, make yourself its expert, worshiper, high priest, partner, creator, propagandist, and indispensable ally. Make the most of it. If the most appears to be more than you can imagine, multiply your imagination. Conventional wisdom is to not put all of your eggs in one basket. 80-20 wisdom is to choose the basket carefully, load all your eggs into it, and then watch it like a hawk. Such beautiful imagery there, but it really is true. Like I said, as soon as you let go of that 80%, you have to double down, triple down, 5x, 10x that 20% and really focus on it. And it's interesting that he really mirrors a quote from Warren Buffett that I like. He says to keep all your eggs in one basket, but watch the basket closely. And what I wanted to ask is, are you hedging? Are you hedging your bets? Human beings naturally want to hedge our bets, limit our downsides and risk. Obviously, we only get one life. It's not a video game, so it might be the right idea in theory. By hedging our bets, we lose out on the power of 80-20, which really is going to cause us to lose, even though we are hedging our bets. So hedging looks like this. It looks like waiting for the right time. It looks like not focusing on the one thing that you should be doing. It's having too many projects or being too afraid to fire the clients that you know that you should. And what I would say is, are you hedging? Are you finding these types of things in your life in order to make sure that you can't possibly lose? But in the process of that, are you actually losing because you're not being able to win at the 80-20 principle? And instead of hedging your bets, what you could do instead is obviously discover what you're passionate about. Exactly like we talked about in What's Easy. Focus your energy. That's exactly what we talked about in application, focusing your energy. You could continue to use the 80-20 principle as we talked about in many different areas, in business, relationships, and learning, so many different ways. And most of all, you have to remember to be unreasonable. Hedging your bets seems completely reasonable. As I said, we only get one life. It's not a video game. But the unreasonable man, that's who we want to be. And the unreasonable man is not going to hedge his bets. So I want to thank you guys for being with me today. This is the 80-20 principle by Richard Koch. If you want to get the mind map, you can get it at the links down below. And if you're interested in my self-coaching course, you can check it out at the links down below as well. Thanks for being with me today, and I hope to see you in the next one.